Welcome to Stories with Grandma Celine, where timeless African wisdom comes alive. Sit close, open your heart, and journey into tales filled with lessons, adventure, proverbs, and mystery. Every story carries the voice of our ancestors, guiding, teaching, and inspiring. Subscribe and share with friends and family. Turn on your notification bell so you never miss a story as Grandma Celine shares a fresh tale every other day. Let's keep the wisdom of our heritage alive, one story at a time. Join Grandma Celine as she narrates a powerful modern folktale about the strength found in silence. When Naomi overhears George devaluing her to his friends, she doesn't fight for a seat at a table where respect is no longer served. She leaves the table entirely. This story explores the quiet departure, a move so strategic and so final that it leaves a man standing in the ruins of a life he didn't realize he wasn't paying for. In the glittering high-rise apartments of Lekki, silence is rarely what it seems. For 5 years, Naomi was the invisible architect of George's success, the pillar holding up a house he thought he built alone. She was the one who paid the bills, managed the chaos, and loved him through the shadows. But in Lagos, secrets have a way of surfacing when the music is loudest. One sentence, spoken in a moment of drunken arrogance, shattered a 5-year illusion. "I'd rather die than marry her." Without a scream, without a scene, and without a second chance, Naomi chose a path few have the courage to take. This is the story of the silent exit, a journey of betrayal, the reclaiming of self-worth, and the devastating realization a man faces when he finally kicks down the pillar that was holding up his world. The humid Lagos air clung to the balcony of the Lekki apartment like a damp cloth. Inside, the sounds of Afrobeat and clinking glasses suggested a celebration. Naomi moved through the crowd with the grace of a woman who knew her place, or thought she did. For 5 years, she had been the scent of jasmine in George's home, and the steady hand behind his success. George stood at the center of his friends, his laughter booming. To the world, they were the power couple of the island. She had paid for the catering tonight. She had even picked out the silk shirt George wore. As she headed toward the kitchen to check on the small chops, she felt a swell of pride. She was waiting for a proposal she felt was only days away. But as she approached the cracked kitchen door, she heard George's voice drop to a conspiratorial whisper. The laughter of his friends turned into that jagged, mocking tone men use when they think no one is listening. "So George," his friend Cunnel chuckled, "when are we buying the Rousseau Ebi for the wedding? Naomi is practically the wife already." The silence that followed was brief, but the answer that cut through it was sharper than a butcher's knife. "Wedding," George snorted, the sound dripping with disdain. "I'm using her to steady my feet, Cunnel. A man doesn't marry the crutch he uses to walk. I'd rather die than marry her." Naomi froze. The tray in her hand didn't shake, but the world around her tilted. In that moment, the golden cage didn't just open, it vanished. The air in the kitchen felt thin, as if George's words had sucked out all the oxygen. Naomi stood paralyzed, her fingers gripping the edge of the marble countertop she had picked out and paid for just last summer. Inside the living room, the men laughed again, a hollow, jagged sound that grated against her ears. She had a choice. She could burst through that door, scream until her throat was raw, and shatter the expensive champagne glasses against the wall. That was what Lagos expected. That was the drama George would later use to justify his cruelty. Instead, Naomi took a deep, shuddering breath. She smoothed her dress, touched her hair, and donned a mask of absolute calm. When she stepped back into the living room, she didn't look at George. She looked through him. "The small chops are served," she said, her voice a steady melody that betrayed nothing. George turned, a smug grin on his face, oblivious to the fact that the woman standing before him was no longer the woman he knew. "Thanks, babe, you're the best." "I know," she replied simply. For the rest of the night, Naomi played the perfect hostess. She refilled drinks, laughed at stale jokes, and played the part of the devoted partner. But internally, she was performing a cold audit. She counted the years, the sacrifices, and the hidden investments. By the time the last guest stumbled out into the Lekki night, Naomi had already mentally checked out of the relationship. The heart had finished its mourning. Now it was time for the feet to move. The apartment was finally quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioner. George threw himself onto the plush sofa, loosening his tie. Great night, wasn't it? Everyone was impressed. Naomi stood by the window, watching the distant lights of the bridge. "Yes, George, it was an enlightening night." "You okay? You seem quiet," he remarked, closing his eyes. He didn't wait for an answer. He never did. He assumed her silence was just exhaustion from serving his ego. She watched him. This was the man she had envisioned at the end of an aisle. This was the man she had supported when his startup faltered, the one whose laundry she folded while she managed her own thriving business. He looked so small now, draped across the furniture she had bought. She realized then that George didn't love her. He loved the version of himself that existed when she was around. She was his mirror, his cushion, and his bank account. "I'm going to start tidying up," she said. "Leave it for the maid in the morning, Naomi. Come to bed." "No," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I want everything in its right place before the sun comes up." As George drifted into a deep, alcohol-induced sleep in the bedroom, Naomi stood in the center of the living room. She didn't cry. Tears were for things that could be mended. This was a death, and deaths required a burial. In Lagos, the night has ears, but it also has secrets. Naomi moved with the precision of a ghost. She pulled out 2 large suitcases from under the guest bed. She didn't take everything, only what was truly hers. She packed her documents first, the C of O for her landed property in Ibajuleki, her passport, her business registration. Then came the clothes. She left behind the expensive dresses George had bought her for status. She took the ones she had bought with her own sweat. Every item she placed in the bag was a cord being cut. She remembered the day they moved in here. They had toasted to forever. She realized now that George, forever, had an expiration date she hadn't been told about. She looked at the framed photo on the mantelpiece, them laughing at a beach in Tarkwa Bay. She took the photo out of the frame, tore her image out of it, and left his half sitting face down on the cold wood. She sent a single text to her brother, Tund. "I'm coming over, bring the truck, don't ask questions, just come to the back gate." The transition was beginning. She wasn't just moving house, she was moving her soul out of a space where it was no longer respected. The quiet strength Grandma Selene often spoke of was flowing through her veins like liquid fire. By 3 a.m., the truck was idling silently at the service entrance of the apartment complex. Tund stood there, his face etched with worry, but he stayed silent as Naomi emerged with the last of her bags. "Is that all?" Tund whispered, glancing up at the darkened windows of the 3rd floor. "Everything that matters is already in the car," Naomi replied. She handed the spare key to the security guard, a man she had been kind to for years. She pressed a generous tip into his hand. "Don't open the door for anyone until 8 a.m. Okay, Baba." The old man nodded, sensing the gravity of the moment. "Go well, madam, God go follow you." As the truck pulled away, Naomi looked back at the building one last time. She didn't feel regret. She felt a strange, terrifying lightness. George was still up there, sleeping in a bed she had styled, in a life she had curated, dreaming of a future where he could continue to use her. He would wake up to an empty house. He would wake up to a kitchen without coffee, a closet with empty hangers, and a woman who had finally heard him loud and clear. In the distance, the first hint of dawn began to grey the Lagos skyline. The lesson was beginning. The sun crawled over the Lagos lagoon, sending sharp shards of light through the bedroom curtains. George groaned, his head throbbing from the previous night's cognac. He reached out his hand, expecting to feel the familiar warmth of Naomi's side of the bed, but his fingers met only cold, taut linen. "Naomi, babe, get the water," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. Silence. He sat up, squinting against the glare. The room felt strangely large. Usually Naomi was already up, her soft footsteps and the scent of lemon water filling the air. He figured she was in the kitchen, perhaps annoyed by the mess from the party. He stumbled into the hallway, rehearsing a half-hearted apology for his hangover. "Naomi, I know, the place is a wreck, I'll call the cleaners." When he entered the living room, he stopped dead. The space looked the same, yet fundamentally different. The centerpiece she loved was gone. The small, personal trinkets that turned a house into a home were absent, but it was when he reached the walk-in closet that the truth hit him like a physical blow. Half the hangers were bare, her jewelry boxes empty. The vanity where she applied her perfume was stripped of its bottles. There was no note, no dramatic letter written in lipstick, just a void where 5 years of his life used to be. George felt a sudden, frantic beat in his chest. For the first time in his life, the silence of the apartment felt deafening. George paced the apartment, his phone pressed to his ear. "The number you are calling is switched off. Please try again later." He checked the kitchen. The fridge was full, but the life was gone. He noticed the framed photo on the mantelpiece. When he saw his own face staring back, solitary and torn away from Naomi's image, his stomach churned. "She heard me," he whispered to the empty room. The memory of the kitchen conversation flashed through his mind, his own voice boasting and cruel. He had thought he was being the man, showing his friends that he wasn't whipped, that he was the one in control. He had used those words as armor for his ego, never imagining that the person he was stepping on would simply get up and walk away. He tried to laugh it off. "She'll be back," he told his reflection in the hallway mirror. "She has nowhere to go, all her things are here." But as he looked around, he realized she had taken the essentials, her spirit, her dignity, and her presence. The expensive sofa he sat on suddenly felt uncomfortable, like a borrowed chair in a stranger's house. He realized then that he didn't even know how to turn on the complex espresso machine she had bought. He was a king in a kingdom that had vanished overnight. While George paced the marble floors of Lekki, Naomi was sitting in the small, sun-drenched parlour of her aunt's house in Surula. The air here smelled of frying plantains and old books, a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of the life she had just fled. Her brother Tund sat across from her, handing her a steaming mug of tea. He hadn't asked a single question during the drive. He knew his sister. He knew that for Naomi to leave in the middle of the night, the ground beneath her must have turned to glass. "You're safe here, sis," Tund said softly. "The gates are locked. If he shows up, he deals with me." Naomi nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she held the mug. The adrenaline that had carried her through the packing was beginning to fade, replaced by a hollow ache. It wasn't that she missed George, she missed the woman she thought she was when she was with him. "He said he'd rather die than marry me, Tund," she whispered, her voice breaking for the first time. Tund's expression hardened. "Then he has already died to us. A man who does not see the value of the gold in his hand deserves to hold nothing but dust." Naomi closed her eyes. She wasn't ready to forgive, and she wasn't ready to forget. But as she listened to the sounds of children playing in the street outside, she realized that for the first time in 5 years, she didn't have to perform for anyone. By midday, George's arrogance had turned into full-blown panic. It wasn't just that he missed Naomi, it was that his life was rapidly deconstructing without her. An email arrived from the landlord. The rent for the Lekki apartment was due in 2 weeks. George stared at the figure. He had forgotten that Naomi paid 60% of the rent. He checked his banking app. His latest investment had tied up his liquid cash. He had relied on her stability to fund his ambition. He called his mother, hopping for sympathy. "Mama, Naomi moved out, she just left." There was a long silence on the other end. His mother, a woman who had seen through George's vanity years ago, sighed. "George, a woman like Naomi does not just leave, she is driven away. What did you do?" "I didn't do anything, I just said some things to the guys. She must have overheard, she's overreacting." "No," his mother snapped. "She is finally reacting. You thought you were playing a game where you held all the cards, but you forgot that Naomi was the one who bought the table. Don't call me to complain about a fire you started yourself." George hung up, the sting of the words fueling his frustration. He decided he would go to her office. He would find her, apologize, maybe even buy a ring today and bring her back. He just needed her to fix the mess. George arrived at Naomi's interior design studio in Victoria Island, his heart hammering. He expected to see her car in the lot, to walk in and see her busy with fabric samples. He would charm her, tell her he was joking, and everything would go back to normal. But when he reached the glass doors, they were locked. A sign hung on the handle, "Closed for renovations. For inquiries, contact our digital office." He pounded on the glass. "Naomi, I know you're in there." A security guard approached, the same one Naomi had tipped for years. "Oga, madam, no day, she travel." "Travel where, when?" "I know no Oga, she say make I no let anybody way no get appointment enter." "And you," the guard looked at him with a knowing, pitying gaze, "you no get appointment." George stood on the sidewalk, the Lagos heat pressing down on him. For the first time he realized that Naomi hadn't just moved out of the apartment, she had moved out of his reach. She had spent 5 years building a shield around his life, and in one night she had taken that shield with her. He was standing in the middle of a crowd, but he had never felt more alone. The lesson of the silent exit was beginning to take hold. Silence is not an absence of sound, it is an absence of presence. In the quiet of her aunt's house, Naomi did not spend her days crying. Instead, she spent them with a notebook. Grandma Celine always said that when a woman leaves a burning house, she must first check her skin for soot before she puts on new clothes. Naomi made 2 columns, what I gave and what I received. Under what I gave, the list was endless. Emotional labor, half the rent, the branding for George's firm, the patience of a saint, and 5 years of her prime. Under what I received, the page remained hauntingly white. She had received a status that was actually a shackle. She had received a home that was actually a hotel where she was the only employee. It is a hard thing to realize you were an investor in a bankrupt soul, her Aunt Ifoma said, sitting beside her with a bowl of peeled oranges. I feel so foolish, Auntie, Naomi whispered. I thought if I built the man would build the home. Auntie Ifoma shook her head. A woman can provide the water, the seeds and the soil, Naomi, but she cannot provide the will to grow. That must come from the man. You were watering a plastic flower and wondering why it never bore fruit. That afternoon, Naomi deleted every photo of George from her phone. She didn't block him. That would show he still had the power to move her emotions. She simply changed her number and moved him to the trash folder of her life. Back in Lekki, the reality of bachelor life was not the party George had imagined. Within 3 days, the apartment was a tomb of laundry and dirty dishes. The maid Naomi had managed and paid for didn't show up. She had been told by Naomi that her services were no longer required there. George's friends, the ones who had laughed so loudly at his "I'd rather die" comment, were suddenly busy. Hey Cunnel, let's grab a drink, George said over the phone. George, I'm tied up with the wife, man. You know how it is. Besides, isn't Naomi hosting those Sunday brunches anymore? Those were the best. George realized with a jolt that his social standing was tied to Naomi's hospitality. People didn't come to see him. They came for the warmth, the food, and the atmosphere Naomi created. Without her, he was just a man in an expensive apartment with an empty fridge. When he tried to pay the electricity bill, he realized he didn't even have the account number. Everything was in Naomi's name. As the power clicked off that evening, plunging him into the sweltering darkness of a Lagos night, George sat on his designer sofa and finally felt the weight of the crutch he had thrown away. Desperation is a loud neighbor. At 11 p.m. George showed up at Naomi's parents' house in Ikja. He looked disheveled, his silk shirt stained, his eyes bloodshot. He hammered on the gate until Naomi's father, a man of few words and a heavy gaze, walked out. Sir, I need to see Naomi. I know she's here. I made a mistake, a joke that went wrong. I want to apologize. I have a ring, George shouted through the bars. Naomi's father didn't open the gate. He stood there, a lantern in his hand, looking at George as if he were a strange insect. My daughter is not a mistake you can correct with a piece of gold, George, the old man said, his voice like rolling thunder. You told the world you would rather die than marry her. In our tradition, words are spirits. You have already buried the relationship. Why are you trying to exhume the body? I love her, sir. No, her father replied calmly. You love the convenience she provided. You love the mirror she held up to your ego. If you truly loved her, you would have been honored to have her name next to yours. Go home, George. The sun has set on this story. The gate remained locked. George stood in the dust, the ring box in his pocket feeling like a lead weight. While George was begging at gates, Naomi was in a warehouse in a different part of the city. She had found a new space for her studio, a raw industrial loft with high ceilings and massive windows. She spent the nights painting the walls herself. Every stroke of white paint felt like she was covering the shadows of the last 5 years. She wasn't just building a business, she was building a fortress of self-reliance. She began to take on new clients, but this time she vetted them differently. She looked for people who valued her time, her vision, and her worth. The word of her silent exit had spread through the Lagos grapevine. Surprisingly, she found more respect than pity. A woman who can leave a 5-year investment without a scream is a woman who knows her own value, one of her new high-end clients remarked. Naomi realized that her silence hadn't been a sign of weakness, it had been her greatest negotiation. By refusing to argue, she had refused to give George any more of her energy. She was becoming the woman of the wind, untrackable, untouchable, and moving forward. 1 week before his rent was due, George caught a glimpse of Naomi at a gallery opening in Victoria Island. She was wearing a dress the color of the midnight sky, surrounded by people who were leaning in to hear her speak. She looked radiant, not the exhausted radiance of a woman trying to keep a man happy, but the glowing light of a woman who was happy with herself. George pushed through the crowd, his heart racing. Naomi, Naomi, wait. She turned, her eyes met his, and for a second the world stopped. George expected to see anger, or perhaps the familiar flicker of devotion he had exploited for so long. But as she looked at him, Naomi realized something profound. He didn't look like a king or a power partner anymore. He looked like a stranger, a small, desperate man clinging to a version of her that no longer existed. "George," she said, her voice cool and polite, as if speaking to a distant acquaintance. "Babe, please, let's talk. I've changed. I've realized everything. The house is empty without you. I'm empty without you." Naomi smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "The house isn't empty, George, it's just full of you now. Isn't that what you wanted?" The gallery fell silent as onlookers watched the exchange. In Lagos, a breakup of 5 years isn't just personal, it's public property. George reached for Naomi's hand, but she stepped back with a grace that felt like a slap. "Naomi, don't do this here," George hissed, his desperation turning into a familiar flash of irritation. "People are watching. You're making a scene by being so cold." "I am not making a scene, George. I am making a boundary," she replied. As she walked away, the whispers began. Some women nodded in silent solidarity, recognizing the look of a woman who had finally seen the light. Others, mostly the older aunties of the social scene, shook their heads. To them, a woman's worth was tied to her ability to endure a man's foolishness until he settled down. Later that night, Naomi's phone buzzed with messages from mutual friends. "George is a mess, Naomi. He's drinking. He says he's lost his mind. Can't you just talk to him? 5 years is a long time to throw away over one comment." Naomi deleted the messages. She realized that 5 years was the cost of her education. She wasn't throwing them away, she was finally graduating. The deadline for the rent arrived like a debt collector at the door. George sat in the darkening apartment, the for rent notice mocking him from the kitchen counter. He had spent the last week trying to secure a loan to keep up the appearance of his lecky lifestyle, but without Naomi's steady income as a guarantee, the banks were cold. He looked at the space where her piano used to sit. He looked at the empty walls where her art had hung. The apartment didn't just feel empty, it felt hostile. Every corner reminded him of a convenience he had mocked and a woman he had devalued. His friends, the same ones who had heard his boastful, "I'd rather die" speech, stopped calling. They weren't interested in a man who was struggling. They were interested in the George who hosted lavish parties with Naomi's catering. He realized with a bitter sting that he had built his reputation on her back. Now that she had walked away, he was sinking into the floorboards. The king was sitting on a throne of dust, realizing that the crown had always belonged to the queen he drove away. Back in the village for a brief weekend of reflection, Naomi sat at the feet of Grandma Celine. The old woman was shelling egusi seeds, her hands moving with a rhythm that spanned generations. "Grandma," Naomi said, looking at the horizon, "the world says I am heartless for leaving without a word. They say I should have stayed to fight for what we built." Grandma Celine paused, her milky eyes finding Naomi's face. "My child, when a termite enters the wood of a house, you do not stay to argue with the termite. You do not ask the termite why it eats the foundation. You leave the house before it falls on your head." The old woman tossed a seed into the bowl. "Silence is the only language a fool understands. If you had screamed, he would have felt important. Because you walked away in silence, he has to face the monster in the mirror alone. You didn't kill the love, Naomi. You just stopped feeding the corpse." Naomi felt a weight lift from her chest. The Lagos drama she had avoided wasn't a sign of weakness, it was her liberation. She wasn't a victim of a breakup, she was the architect of her own rescue. George, now facing eviction and a crumbling social reputation, decided on one last, grand gesture. He believed that if he could just humiliate himself enough, Naomi's nurturing nature would take over and she would return to save him. He showed up at her new studio during a high-profile launch event. He didn't come with flowers, he came with a megaphone and a public apology. "Naomi, I am a fool," he shouted from the street, drawing a crowd of onlookers and bloggers. "I take it back, I will marry you tomorrow, I'll give you everything." Naomi stood behind the glass of her new office watching him. She didn't feel the rush of triumph she expected. She felt pity. He was still performing. Even his apology was a show, a way to make the narrative about his suffering and his grand gesture. She didn't go outside. She didn't send security to move him. She simply pulled the blinds and turned up the music in the studio. She chose to be invisible to a man who had only ever seen her as a prop in his own movie. The public stunt failed. The bloggers didn't write about a romantic reunion. They wrote about a lecky big boy's meltdown. George's ego, the very thing he had protected by insulting Naomi, was now the very thing being shredded by the public. He returned to his nearly empty apartment and found his suitcases, the ones Naomi had left behind, sitting by the door. His landlord had changed the locks. George sat on the curb of the busy Lekki road, his designer shoes covered in the dust of a city that has no mercy for the fallen. He pulled out his phone and looked at the last photo he had of Naomi. She was smiling, her eyes bright with a future he was no longer part of. He finally understood. She hadn't left because of a single sentence. She had left because she realized that her presence in his life was a gift he had treated like a transaction. He stayed on that curb until the sun went down, a man who had said he would rather die than marry her, finally realizing that without her, he didn't know how to live. For Naomi, the weeks following George's public meltdown were a harmattan of the soul, a dry, dusty season where everything dead had to fall away. She stopped checking the blogs. She stopped asking why. Instead, she focused on her craft. Her new studio became a sanctuary of light and color. She realized that for 5 years, she had been designing spaces for others while her own internal house was in shambles. She began to travel, taking commissions in Abuja and Accra, expanding her horizons beyond the narrow streets of Lekki. She discovered that she liked her own company. She liked the silence of her new apartment, which wasn't empty but spacious. She wasn't waiting for a text, a ring, or an apology. She was simply breathing. "You look different," her brother Tund remarked one evening as they shared a meal. "The weight in your shoulders is gone." "I stopped carrying a man who had legs but refused to walk," Naomi replied. She realized then that the greatest miracle wasn't that she had left George, it was that she had found herself. Months later, Naomi was at a corporate gala. She was no longer the partner of George. She was Naomi, the award-winning designer. As she stood near the terrace, she saw a man standing alone by the bar. It was George. He looked older. The spark of arrogance that once defined him had been replaced by a weary, hollowed-out look. He approached her, but this time he didn't shout or perform. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who had finally seen the sun after a long time in the dark. "I just wanted to say, you were right," he whispered. "I didn't just lose a wife, I lost the only person who actually knew me. I'm starting over, Naomi. In a small place in Yaba, it's hard." Naomi looked at him. She felt no anger, no satisfaction, and, most importantly, no desire to fix his life. "Growth is often hard, George," she said gently. "I hope you find the man you were supposed to be before you started pretending, but that man is no longer my responsibility." She walked away, and for the first time she didn't look back to see if he was following. In the bustling markets of Lagos, the story of the woman who walked in silence became a local legend. Women whispered it over piles of peppers and rolls of lace. It became a cautionary tale for the big boys and a battle cry for the good women. The lesson was clear: love is a partnership, not a charity. Auntie Ifoma saw Naomi's face on the cover of a business magazine and smiled. She remembered the night Naomi arrived in Surulere with nothing but 2 suitcases and a shattered heart. "The tree that survives the storm doesn't do it by fighting the wind," Ifoma told her neighbors. "It does it by having roots that are deeper than the wind can reach." Naomi's roots were always there, she just had to clear away the weeds to see them. The story wasn't about a breakup anymore. It was about the quiet strength that exists in every woman who decides that enough is a complete sentence. A year to the day since she moved out, Naomi stood on the balcony of her own home, a house she had bought and designed herself. There were no shared bills here. There were no shared dreams that weren't hers first. She looked at the Lagos skyline, the twinkling lights of the city she once feared would swallow her whole. She realized that George's words, "I'd rather die than marry her," were the greatest gift he had ever given her. They were the alarm clock that woke her up from a dream that was actually a nightmare. She picked up a pen and wrote in her journal, "I did not lose 5 years. I bought a lifetime of freedom." She was whole, she was vibrant, and she was open to love again, not the kind of love that required her to be a crutch, but the kind of love that was like the meeting of 2 deep rivers. She knew now that her value wasn't something a man could grant her, it was something she carried in her very DNA. You cannot build a future with someone who sees you only as a tool for their convenience. In this life, we often confuse length of time with depth of value. Naomi spent 5 years watering a garden, only to realize she was pouring her life into a desert. George's mistake was not just his words. It was the arrogance of believing that Naomi's love was a permanent debt she owed him, rather than a gift she chose to give. True strength is not found in how much disrespect you can endure to keep a relationship alive. True strength is the ability to pick up your crown and walk out of a room where your name is being dragged in the dust. When a man tells you, even in a whisper, that he does not value you, believe him. Do not stay to convince him otherwise. Your absence is the only lesson a man who devalues your presence will ever truly learn. Naomi walked away from 5 years of her life in a single night. She didn't seek revenge, she simply sought herself. But Lagos is a city of many opinions, and some say she should have stayed to fight for her home. I want to hear from you in the comments. Did Naomi do the right thing by leaving in silence, or was she too harsh to walk away after 5 years without a single conversation? If you were in her shoes and overheard those words, would you have packed your bags that night, or would you have stayed to demand an explanation? Drop your thoughts below, let's discuss. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this wisdom with someone who needs to remember their own worth today.